A moment ago, they had no idea who I was. Their eyes skimmed over me, from the polished black shoes to the skin they thought didn't belong. One smug gesture, a cold smile, and, as if by script, they politely asked me to leave. I didn't argue, didn't bother explaining who I really was. Why should I? The real show was yet to come. Very soon, they'd realize that this hotel, which they so carefully guarded against me, now belongs to me. Standing at the entrance of a luxurious hotel, I couldn't shake the absurdity of the situation. My suit fit me perfectly, my shoes gleamed like mirrors, and in my pocket lay the key to a world I had already conquered: wealth, success, recognition. Yet, despite all that, a wall had appeared in front of me, not one of stone or glass, but of human prejudice, of a narrow perspective that couldn't see past the color of my skin. I felt their eyes on me, evaluating, weighing, and finally branding me. To them, I was just a black man who had clearly walked through the wrong door. In their world, I was an anomaly, a mistake, the one detail that didn't fit into their perfect picture of luxury. This place was supposed to radiate prestige, comfort, and hospitality. Yet the air was thick with tension. The staff had already started looking at me like a potential problem. In that moment, when you feel like a stranger in someone else's world, the question isn't about how much money you have, but how long you can endure before something changes. I wasn't angry. What struck me more was how quickly these people judged you by your appearance without even considering who you really were. It didn't bother me. The money I had earned could open any door, but I had already learned that money can only buy what hasn't been poisoned by human prejudice. I didn't need to prove my worth to these people. My story was just beginning. As I walked inside, every step I took on that marble floor felt like a challenge. The spacious lobby, adorned with golden chandeliers, luxurious furniture, and flawless design, was supposed to inspire admiration, but all I felt was a chill. Not from the air conditioning, but from the people who inhabited this place. Here, luxury intertwined with arrogance. My goal was simple: check in like any other guest. But on my way to the reception desk, I noticed the hotel staff exchanging glances. I approached the desk, where the manager stood, a Caleb man with a rehearsed smile, who, without even looking up, already knew what he was going to say. When he finally did look at me, his gaze spoke louder than any words. He scanned me as if seeing everything at once, how impeccably I was dressed, and how little it mattered to him. "I'm sorry, but there are no available rooms for you," he said with faint politeness. What surprised me wasn't the rejection itself, but his certainty. He spoke as if he wasn't the one making the decision, as if something larger, a system that had trained him to judge people by their appearance, was speaking through him. In this world, luxury and arrogance went hand in hand, and his words felt like the final act of a play that, for me, had only just begun. I could have said my name, and the situation would have changed instantly. They would have rushed to apologize, offered me the best suite, showered me with compliments. But I chose not to break their little performance. I wanted to see how far they were willing to go. A Levi Thomas, a large man with a shaved head, approached me as I still stood by the desk. His face was impassive, but his politeness teetered on the edge of forcefulness. He approached with the kind of insistence that made it clear there was nothing to discuss. "Please leave the hotel," he said, his voice polite but brooking no argument. I looked at him without saying a word. In that moment, I had no desire to argue or prove anything. Their ignorance and arrogance had become a lesson I would remember, but not one that deserved an explanation. I turned and headed for the exit. Every step on the marble floor echoed with the inevitability of something yet to come. I knew they had no idea how close they were to their world turning upside down. They only saw in me what they wanted to see. But their world was about to change. After a few steps, I stopped and glanced back. This hotel would soon be mine, and then they would know how easily illusions can be shattered. A few weeks had passed since the day I left the hotel, avoiding an unnecessary conflict. Back then, I walked away without a word, but not without a plan. During that time, a clear strategy had formed in my mind to reclaim not only my dignity, but also control over their world. The irony of life was that I had always been a step ahead of those who were used to judging by appearances. Now, I stood in the same city, in front of the same building, but with a different status. I was no longer just a guest. I was the new owner. As I made my way to the lawyers to sign the purchase documents, I felt a mixture of emotions, not anger. I had long since learned not to waste energy on that, but rather anticipation. This was the moment when insults turned into strength, when humiliation transformed into an opportunity for power. I wasn't planning to seek revenge through petty pranks or childish antics. No, my goal was more complex, to make them dismantle their own illusions. Their pride would be their undoing. Sitting in the lawyer's office, I couldn't help but smirk as I looked at the papers confirming my ownership of the hotel. The hotel was now mine, and this was only the first step. After signing the documents, I arrived at the hotel with a new objective: to begin my observation. The entire staff continued working, unaware that their world was about to change. To them, I remained invisible. My name had yet to be mentioned in the boardroom, which gave me the freedom to observe them in their natural habitat. The meeting with the hotel's Declan manager went as expected. Formal, he was a confident, somewhat arrogant man who likely believed he had everything under control. "Our staff is stable and professional," he said, with a hint of pride in his voice. "We haven't had to let anyone go in a long time, and our turnover rate is minimal." I nodded, maintaining a calm expression. But inside, my certainty was growing. Their world was teetering on the edge of disaster, and they had no idea. I studied each of them, the very same Caleb manager who had denied me a room, the Levi Thomas who had escorted me out the door. All of these people went about their lives blissfully unaware of the chasm opening beneath them. As I descended the stairs after the meeting, I paused for a moment, reflecting. Should I act immediately, expose them all, and fire them in one sweeping motion? Or should I let them continue to live in their delusion for a while longer, enjoying their false sense of stability? My plan hinged on one thing: patience. The day I decided to begin my little show came unexpectedly. I was walking down the corridor, glancing around the lobby when I saw him. The manager, the same Caleb one. He was engrossed in his work, occasionally glancing up from his papers to review something in a logbook. He didn't notice me. I was standing just a few feet away, but this time, I wasn't invisible. I was the owner of this building, though only I knew it. His face was relaxed, oblivious to the fact that the fate of his job was already in my hands. For a moment, I considered how easy it would be to change everything in that instant. One word, and he'd lose his position. His confidence and comfortable life would crumble. But where's the satisfaction in that? My enjoyment lay in watching them dig their own graves, in seeing how their actions would lead them to their own downfall. I wanted them to realize their mistake. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. Smiling silently, I turned and continued walking. Ahead of me lay much more important steps. Today I was walking into the same hotel, but it wasn't the same day I left it feeling humiliated. Now, I returned with a sense of complete power. Everything had changed. This hotel was no longer a fortress that had once rejected me. Now, it was my domain, and I was ready to take control. They didn't even know they'd lost. From early morning, I could feel a certain tension, as if the air had grown thicker. Maybe it was all in my head, but knowing that I was about to face the people who had looked down on me just weeks ago filled me with energy. I was calm, cold even, but inside, my resolve was boiling. The only question was, how would they react when they realized their world had shifted? Before stepping into the conference room, I paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and allowed myself a brief smile. I knew I was doing this without any warning. No prior notice to prepare them. That was the whole point. I wanted them to feel a sense of chaos, as if the ground were slipping from beneath their feet. When I entered the conference room, everyone was already seated. They didn't notice me at first. I chose a seat in the corner where I could observe without drawing attention. The manager, the same one who had denied me a room, stood by the board, speaking confidently. He laid out the day's plans for the staff, discussing tasks with the same arrogance he'd shown when he looked me in the eyes and passed his judgment on my unsuitable status, I sat quietly, watching him. He had no idea his world had just collapsed. In the moment our eyes met, I saw his expression change. It was brief, just a second, but I saw recognition in his eyes. He froze, his words caught mid-sentence. First, his face turned gray, then a mask of professionalism appeared. "Who are you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. His voice was steady, but icy. The entire room fell silent, everyone turning their attention to the silent confrontation between us. "I'm your new owner," I replied calmly with a slight smile. The room was engulfed in silence. My voice was calm, but its impact was devastating. I watched as emotions flickered across his face: disbelief, shock, and then fear. This was the pivotal moment. No one in the room uttered a word. It felt as if even the air had stilled, waiting in anticipation. The employee's eyes darted between me and the manager, back and forth. It was the kind of silence that comes just before a storm, before something grand happens, and you realize there's nothing you can do to stop it. The manager tried to say something, his lips moving, but the words stuck in his throat. His breathing grew heavier, his face paler, and his eyes began to flit nervously around the room. I could see his carefully constructed plans unraveling in his mind, all the illusions he'd built over the years collapsing. He couldn't believe that the man he had once looked down on was now his boss, that his career, his stability, had been destroyed with a single phrase. This was the beginning of the end for him. Everything he had considered his strength and advantage, his position, his status, his influence, was now working against him. He was just another subordinate now. And the most ironic part? He now answered to the person he had once dismissed. I stood up and headed for the exit. The entire room remained silent, still in disbelief at what had just happened. But this was only the beginning. I was ready for this hotel to transform beyond recognition. I was ready to rebuild, not just the walls, but its very structure. After I declared myself the owner of the hotel, no one knew what would come next. They might have expected immediate firings, reshuffling, or drastic changes, but I wasn't interested in playing a predictable game. I was always fascinated by what lies beneath people's masks when they find themselves on the edge of collapse. With each passing day, I became more aware of the extent of my power. I could destroy their confidence and their illusions at any moment. But I chose a different path. It wasn't enough to simply tear off their masks. I wanted them to remove them themselves, to watch as their familiar worlds crumbled, and to realize the full weight of their prejudices. One morning, as I prepared for the day ahead, I felt a wave of quiet satisfaction. Now I could watch as they, under the pressure of a new reality, revealed their true selves. To start, I decided to change the work schedule. They were now tasked with duties they once considered beneath their elevated positions. I made them interact with lower-level employees as equals. This was my test, to observe how their arrogance would erode. A few weeks passed since I had implemented the new rules. Every day felt like a chess game, where my pieces were strategically positioned, waiting for the right move. I observed them, studied their reactions, watched as their arrogance gave way to insecurity. Those who once looked down on others now found themselves in situations where they had to do what they once considered unworthy. I saw how the manager, always so self-assured, began to lose his grip. His pride eroded as he was forced to negotiate with junior staff or oversee minor tasks he had never deigned to handle. His face grew tenser with each passing day, a sense of helplessness building within him, though he still tried to hold on. The other employees also started to crack under the pressure. Their confidence in their own importance was melting like ice under the sun. They all looked lost, and that was where my satisfaction lay. Conversations grew shorter. No one smiled anymore. I wasn't just the owner of the hotel now. I had become the invisible hand, manipulating their inner fears. One day, during a routine walk through the hotel, I encountered the manager in the lobby. He looked exhausted, his gaze uncertain, but he stepped forward. "We need to talk." His voice trembled, despite his attempt to maintain composure. "About my role in the hotel, about the importance of what I do." I allowed myself a slight smile and stopped in front of him. This was the moment I had been waiting for. As the manager spoke about his important role, I realized the time had come. He was still trying to cling to the illusion of his significance, but his confidence was slowly dying. I didn't interrupt him. I let him speak. His words sounded like a desperate attempt to hold on to something slipping away. He was trying to convince me that his work was essential to the hotel's success, but each argument rang hollow. I knew that in his mind he was only thinking of one thing: how to keep his place beneath me. When he finished, I smiled. It wasn't a mocking smile, but a calm one, filled with power. "I remember you," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "I remember how you kicked me out of here. Do you remember that day?" His face turned pale. I could see the fear piercing through him. He understood that all his words, all his attempts to maintain his significance, were futile. He had nothing left to say. Silence enveloped us both. He tried to open his mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Everything he had built, his arrogance, his false sense of importance, collapsed right in front of him. His role, his mask, it all vanished. He realized he could no longer control the situation. I was now the one deciding his fate. But this was only the first step. Every day in this hotel reminded me of a chess game, where my opponent's moves could be predicted and their strategy dismantled. I knew they saw me as just the owner, someone who stayed in the shadows, but their true selves, their deceit, were gradually coming to the surface. From the moment I first stepped into this hotel as its master, I knew only patience would allow me to fully uncover them. I began assigning them small tasks that, at first, seemed ordinary: a schedule change, additional responsibilities, minor shifts in the structure. But for me, this was a test. I was weaving a web, with every move calculated down to the smallest detail. I wanted to see how far they would go to maintain their positions. It's remarkable how people so used to stability begin to lose their footing when the world around them starts to change. It's under such conditions that the true nature of a person is revealed. Lies and arrogance always lead to collapse, and I was prepared to watch them destroy themselves. With each day, as I added new tasks, I observed how their reactions shifted. At first, they responded with mild irritation. Why should these changes affect them? But soon, I noticed someone starting to cover up their mistakes, others hiding their shortcomings, and still others throwing their colleagues under the bus. I sat in my office, watching as the atmosphere in the team grew increasingly tense. All these years, they had built their careers on deception and false confidence. But now, with the rules of the game changed, each of them was confronted with a new reality, where their old strategies no longer worked. One employee lied about completing a task, another openly sabotaged their colleagues, yet another tried to shift the blame onto others. One day, I overheard a brief exchange between two employees. "I can't get this done on time, but if you help me, I'll tell management it was all your achievement," one of them said, hope in his voice. The other, smirking, replied, "You want me to do your work? No way. I'll just tell them you screwed everything up." That brief dialogue told me everything. They were ready to throw each other under the bus for their own survival. It was the moment their masks began to fall, and each revealed their true nature. At the end of the day, I gathered everyone in the large conference room. They didn't know why they had been summoned, but each of them could already feel the tension. I could see it in their eyes. Some exchanged nervous glances, while others tried to hide their anxiety. When everyone was assembled, I stood before them, letting the silence fill the room. It was a heavy silence, pregnant with inevitability. I slowly looked at each of them. "Today, I want to talk about how your deceit is not only destroying this hotel but also yourselves," I began, my voice calm but firm. "For the past few weeks I've been watching you, and you know what I've seen. Lies. You lie to each other, to yourselves, to me. Each of you has built your career on deceiving someone else, and today I'm here to show you where that's led." I projected the evidence of their schemes: emails, security footage, documents in which they tried to cover their tracks, onto a screen. Their faces turned pale as they stared at the material, realizing there was nowhere left to hide. Their lies were no longer a secret, I paused the video and addressed them again. Your schemes have destroyed you. You thought you could hide behind your deceit, but now that's no longer possible. The look on each of their faces was one of complete despair. They knew the game was over. This wasn't just an exposure. It was the moment they realized their entire lives, built on lies and manipulation, had crumbled. Every step I took in this hotel was calculated, and each one brought me closer to my ultimate goal. Those who once looked down on me were now entangled in their own intrigues, like flies caught in a web. But I wasn't ready to stop. The lies and prejudice ran too deep in these people. For them, it wasn't just a temporary state, but a way of life. I knew they needed more than just exposure. They needed to come face to face with the consequences of their prejudices, not on some abstract level, but in the most personal way possible. I began restructuring the hotel, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. Some employees lost their privileges, while others were given new opportunities. The new staff I hired was predominantly Black. Individuals once sidelined by life now had the chance to lead. Those who once thought themselves superior faced a new reality. They resisted, tried to hold on to their positions, but soon realized it was futile. Their world was collapsing, and all they could do was accept it. I remember the day one of the old managers, the same one who had once denied me a room, came face to face with this new reality. I entered the hotel lobby and saw him standing behind the reception desk, nervously shuffling papers. His face was tense, and his hands trembled slightly. The man who had once been so sure of his authority was now forced to perform the simplest tasks, the kind he had once despised. I stepped closer and watched him. At that moment, a family approached. The desk, a mother, father, and their 2 children. They were all Black. The manager standing behind the counter saw them and instantly turned pale. It wasn't just recognition, it was fear. He realized that now he had to serve those he once rejected, those he had considered beneath him. "Good afternoon," he began, but his voice was weak and shaky. The man from the family nodded politely and said, "We've booked a room for a week. We'd like to check in." The manager awkwardly nodded and began the check-in process, trying to conceal his internal turmoil. His hands moved slowly over the computer keys, and his face showed complete defeat. I could see him shuddering at what was happening. The man who had once looked down on me was now forced to humble himself before those he had once scorned. I silently observed, not intervening. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I saw his prejudices breaking down, his pride being shattered by reality. When the check-in was complete and the family had walked away, I approached the manager. He didn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed on the floor, as if he wanted to disappear, to dissolve in this situation that was dismantling everything he thought he knew about himself and his world. "How does it feel?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. I could see his shoulders slumping, his face pale as if he had lost all strength. "It's just a job," he mumbled, trying to hide the despair in his voice. But I didn't let him escape the truth. "You denied me a room once. Today you served those you despised. How did that feel?" He finally lifted his eyes to meet mine, filled with fear and humiliation. It wasn't just fear of his new boss. It was the realization of his own insignificance, the collapse of all his prejudices and pride. His voice faltered, unsure of what to say. He understood that all his past actions and beliefs had led him to this moment, and now there was no escape except to accept it. I didn't say another word. I simply nodded and walked away. I gave him time to process what had just happened. This wasn't the end, but it was a pivotal moment. He had realized that the old order would never return. I knew everything was coming to an end. Each of the employees who had once been so sure of their superiority had already faced their own trials. I watched as their worlds collapsed, as their lies and prejudices slowly consumed them from within. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was a process of cleansing. They needed more than just to realize their mistakes. They needed to feel their old world slip away beneath their feet. Today was an important day. I had decided to gather everyone in one place. The very people who had once discriminated against me, who had thought themselves better based on false stereotypes. But now their status had changed. I gave them a final choice. They could leave with compensation and forget this chapter of their lives, or they could stay and continue working, but under entirely different rules. I knew many of them wouldn't withstand the pressure, but that didn't concern me. Those who remained would have to undergo complete transformation. My emotions were mixed in that moment. It wasn't a feeling of triumph or vengeance. It was more a sense of closure, as if I was finally closing a chapter of my life. Everything that had happened here wasn't just a personal vendetta, but a lesson, one I had to teach not only to them but also to myself. I stood in the conference room, looking at those who had once been the embodiment of discrimination and prejudice in this hotel. Their faces were grim, many already realizing that the power they once held was gone forever. They no longer controlled the situation. Now everything depended on me. "Today you stand before a choice," I began, watching their reactions. "You have the opportunity to leave with compensation and forget this hotel as a bad dream. Or you can stay and continue working but under new rules. You will have to accept the changes that have happened here and work according to the conditions I set." Some employees immediately lowered their eyes, nervously shuffling papers in front of them. These were the ones who knew they couldn't survive in this new order. They had already decided to leave. Others, those with nothing left to lose, looked at me with uncertainty but also understanding. They knew their options were limited. "Those of you who choose to leave will receive generous compensation. But know this, if you stay, you will have to change everything: your attitude, your work ethic, and your worldview." One of the old managers, the same one who had once refused me service, raised his hand. His face reflected a mix of fear and desperation. "And what happens to us if we leave?" he asked, barely concealing the tremor in his voice. I looked him directly in the eye and replied calmly, "You'll start over without your former privileges, but with the chance to rethink your life." His face darkened. He understood that his old life had been built on lies and arrogance, and now he would have to face a new reality. The last day of their work had arrived. Some employees had already packed their belongings and left the hotel. They couldn't handle the changes and didn't want to accept the new order. Those who remained were beginning to adapt to a reality where they no longer had the false sense of superiority. I walked into the hotel lobby and saw the manager standing near the exit. His shoulders were slumped and he looked broken. This was the same man who had once refused me a room without even bothering to find out who I was. Now he stood before me, fully aware that everything had changed. I approached him and stopped beside him. He didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the floor. "You didn't even try to know who I was," I said to him calmly. He didn't respond. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes were empty. This was a man who had realized that his entire life had been built on false foundations. Now he had nothing left to restore the confidence he once had. He only nodded, still not raising his eyes, and walked out the door. I watched him as he left, understanding that this was inevitable. I didn't feel anger or satisfaction. It was simply the end of a story that had begun with humiliation, but concluded with justice.